Could I please ask to welcome Professor Arama on stage at this present moment in time, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who is the Director for Sustainable Development over at Columbia University in the USA. Can we kindly welcome him with an applause? Also, His Excellency Ambassador Albert Mochanga, the Commissioner for Trade and Industry at the AU. So can you kindly join us on stage? Another warm welcome for him with an applause, please. And we also have Professor Abebe Shimeles, the Honorary Professor for the University of Cape Town and Advisory Ministry of Finance. And last but not least, I believe we do have Professor, or rather His Excellency Professor Mthuli Ncube, who the Minister of Finance and Economic Development over at Zimbabwe, who may be joining us virtually. If that happens, we'll certainly let you know. So I'm also going to take my seat at this present moment in time. Okay. So Professor, you and I can share a mic, and then afterwards the middle mic will be for the other speakers. And I think that it is important just to reflect on the message that was shared during the opening remarks, particularly referencing the percentage growth that we are proud of as a continent in terms of the fact that quite a number of the top growing economies in the world come from here, but also the realism that was put on that percentage growth, just given the fact that people don't eat percentages. Percentages don't fund their living, and percentages certainly don't shield them from some of the adverse effects of climate change, for instance. So the message and the question that I hope that we'll be able to better address right now is how to translate the percentage growth of Africa. And Professor Arama, you mentioned the need for the continent to grow by 7% consistently for 4 decades to achieve some of its goals. Even with that, how to ensure that when we do get there, it is done in such a way that is sustainable, such that a lot more people do have food on their plates, a lot more people have got more money in their pockets. And as I said, a lot more of us are insulated from some of the risks, the broader risks that are keeping a lot of people down in terms of poverty and inequality. So first of all, I'd just like the speakers, other than Professor Arama, just to reflect on some of the key findings of the report as they do pertain to the state of the African economy right now. And Professor Sachs, perhaps just to kick it off with you, sir.
Thank you very much. First, excuse me, this is an excellent report. So I'm extremely happy to read it and to learn from it. Sorry. Yep, thank you. It shows a mixed picture. Africa is achieving moderate economic growth, but there is a considerable amount of financial fragility. This is the main picture. And we want to move from this situation to a situation of much higher growth, which is absolutely feasible, and lower financial fragility. Those go together because, in fact, to get to 7% or even higher growth per year will require long-term, low-cost finance at the center of the strategy. And what one of the very telltale graphs shows is Africa is paying a punishing risk premium on its finance, and it cannot achieve rapid growth if it is paying a risk premium of 750 or 1,000 or even higher basis points on its debt. So, to my mind, the core messages are that Africa is in a circumstance in which it can achieve this goal of sustained, very rapid growth, but it requires a financial, fiscal, and transformation strategy to do so. And many of the elements of that have been laid out. I want to underscore a few points quickly. First, long-term development cannot be based on short-term loans. This is the most important point. Loans for Africa should be at least 25 years or longer. This is a central role for the African Development Bank, but it also means that the Eurobond market is a trap, because if it's 7-year bonds, there will be liquidity crises inevitable when rollovers are needed. We need a financing strategy based on long-term development and long-term borrowing. The maturity structure is fundamental because African countries, sovereigns, borrow in foreign currencies to a significant extent. That will remain true for years to come. That means that there's always liquidity risk, and that means that short-term borrowing is dangerous for long-term development. Just to say, I won't go on too long, I know we have such a wise panel, but to say 7% per year growth means a doubling every 10 years. If you do that 4 times, Africa's economy will be 16 times larger than it is today. What looks like a lot of debt today won't be very large in the future. Africa can bear a lot more debt, in fact, because of rapid growth prospects. But if the debt is 7 years or 10 years and the growth requires 30 to 40 years, there will inevitably be the kinds of fragility that we have right now. This comes to the question of strategy and global financial architecture. We need a much larger African Development Bank. We need much larger long-term funding. When there are partners like the Belt and Road Initiative in China, which I'm a great fan of, the lending should be at least a quarter century, and this is a point that the AU can make in the G20 context to the partners, which is we have the highest growth prospects in the world. This is no doubt true. Africa can grow faster than any other part of the world. It has more headroom, more catching up space. It can achieve absolutely 7 to 10% per year growth, sustained for 4 decades. But it requires the financing and the partnership to do it. What else does it require? It requires the following: a very strong integration at the AU scale. Africa is the same size population as China and as India. Those are each one country. Africa's 55 countries. Africa has to act, though, like one economy. This is extremely important because that scale will be the breakthrough. That's to the advantage of every single one of the 55 countries joined together. Second, that means cross-border infrastructure for power, for fiber, for transport is absolutely essential. This is a great continent, and it needs a great continental infrastructure. This is absolutely key. And the third point that I would emphasize, because I would love to have the chance with these esteemed colleagues to discuss for hours, but the third point that I would emphasize is get every African child in school for a good education, at least through upper secondary. Right now, the completion rate of upper secondary is only around 30%. It needs to be 100%. That's basically a financial barrier, by the way. I think every leader here wants universal education but can't afford it. And this is why finance is so essential. But don't finance education with a 10-year loan, the kids will still be in 10th grade. Finance education with a 40-year loan to give them the chance to graduate, join the workforce, be the skilled workers of the future, and 40 years from now it will be easy to repay. Education has an internal rate of return of at least 20% per annum. But it takes a long time. You can't hurry it. It's one grade at a time. So long-term finance, get every child in school, give them the fiber, give them the digital, give them the basic infrastructure. Africa will be the world's booming, fast-growing region of the world for decades. So this is to move from where we are today, some reasonable performance, but fragility, to the best performance with financial robustness. I think that's the objective. Thank you.
And Prof, a really interesting comment that you do make in reference to the euro bond market being a trap. Just given the, I think the resumption of players entering that bond market that we have seen in the recent while, particularly since the advent of the pandemic. But I want to pick up on a point that you made around scale and Africa acting more as one. And Ambassador Muchanga, I want to pick it up with you. Just as you obviously reflect on the macroeconomic performance outlook, but we do know that one of the ways that the continent is trying to scale up and act more as one is through the Africa Continental Free Trade Area deal. Much has been said about what has been done on the ground so far, what hasn't been done on the ground so far. Perhaps your reflections then on the state of trade dynamics and the potential that, of course, it does have in helping us realize the better growth that we all want to see.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So there's no gender balance, but we're not intimidating you. I think before I go to the issue of continental economic integration, actually it was my number one point in my notes. Let me congratulate the African Development Bank Group for this publication. It's the second one. Very, very, very well researched, very informative, and it's going to be very useful to the policymakers, and like we indicated, the researchers. And certainly, I would encourage you to ensure that when the heads of state and government are meeting tomorrow, if there can be a way of putting the document on their tables. I know there's going to be complaint about language, but at least if they can get the information, that would be very, very, very useful. Professor Sachs raised a fundamental issue, and that's the continental integration. I always say that the long-term future of Africa lies in the accelerated and deeper economic integration. Because the small economies that we have really do not make us very, very competitive in the global markets. And the situation is getting worse now. Because if any one of us wants to export, for example, if you want to export to Europe, you are going to face the cross-border adjustment mechanism. That's another barrier to you really exporting. So if you have an internal market, it's much, much, much easier. And when that market is also functioning very, very well, it can promote productive transformation by ensuring that there's value addition and there's intra-African trade in manufactured goods, and key also intra-African trade in intermediate goods. Because when you look at the structure of manufacturing in Africa, the highest cost element is on the importation of inputs going into manufacturing. We really do not come up with intermediate goods which you can use to add value within the domestic market and trade across the border. So that's one issue where every year we should be emphasizing that we need to deepen the process of economic integration. Now, the other number that I'm very much interested in, the growth rate is very, very important. But the GNI per capita of Africa, I think we need to be looking at that number. Where are we right now? I'm raising this issue because a few days ago, I was reading one report, and it indicated that since 2014, GNI per capita in Africa has been declining by about 10%. I don't know how far true that is. So I think in future editions, let's try to capture that number. It's quite useful. When we go to the G20, a number of issues are going to be high on our agenda. And one of the issues is very sensitive, but we would like to collaborate with the African Development Bank Group and other knowledge partners. And this is the issue of international taxation. The African group, led by Nigeria, were able to win a decision that we should start discussing the question of a framework convention on international tax cooperation, which is inclusive. When the vote came out, virtually all the OECD countries voted against us, except Norway. And their position is that they already have the G20 OECD inclusive framework on base erosion and profit shifting. So in their view, that is enough. So what we need is really to see if we can establish dialogue between ourselves as Africa or the Global South and the OECD to see if there can be a meeting of minds on the efforts that we are making in that area. The issue of debt restructuring is very, very, very important. A few days ago, I was in discussion with one of the State Department at the U.S., used to be Assistant Secretary at the Treasury, indicated that we welcome the Commonwealth framework on debt restructuring, but it's very, very slow. And I think there's a misunderstanding within the official creditors and between the official creditors and the private creditors. Each one of them think they are giving more than the other. So they cannot really compare how they are making, they are contributing to the debt restructuring effort. So it's one of the urgent issues that we need to bring to the G20 to say, how can we facilitate faster debt restructuring? And I think, as emphasized in your report, a lot of our countries are facing debt distress situations. The president of the African Development Group raised an important issue of natural resource governance. As we are going to the COP28, I think there are a number of stories about African countries having carbon trading deals with the other countries around the world. And the numbers that were coming out were very disheartening. It's really, we're underpricing our assets. So again, the African Development Bank, I think we need to work with the countries to ensure that we have common guidelines so that when our countries go, our governments go to really engage in carbon trading, I think we do not undersell our assets. And other than the guidelines, also I think that the issue of accounting for the forestry that we have, we indicated that we are working on that one, which is very, very good. And also training the negotiators on how to come up with very good deals. But right now, I think we are underselling ourselves. So on the whole, it's a very, very good report, and we encourage you to continue publishing it and distribute it as much as you can. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I am now told that we are being joined on the line by Professor Mthuli Ncube, His Excellency. Thank you. His Excellency Professor Mthuli Ncube, of course, the Minister of Finance of Zimbabwe. Sir, oh, we see you. You're looking well. Compliments for the new year, sir. Prof, we are just look at him from the front. We are looking at the state of the African economy. We have been told that we continue to house some of the world's largest growing economies. Of course, this is not entirely new, just given that before we even went into the pandemic, a lot of the top growing economies came from the African continent. But so we're also being told of the importance of certain dynamics in making sure that Africa gets to the next step around restructuring some of the financial construct or architecture, that of course being one in part the responsibility of the traditional architects. But also I would say it is the responsibility of African governments, as it were, to ensure that that restructuring is done well, but also to ensure that they keep their part of the bargain in upholding the highest standards of governance when it does come to how money in the country essentially is being used. So I know that Zimbabwe is trying to do quite a number of things right now in terms of its debt restructuring, also in terms of restoring credibility in its financial markets, particularly its currency. Perhaps we can start off there, so, and just talk about what the state of play is right now, but also more broadly speaking, how you are thinking of the path forward for the African continent, sir. Prof, are you on mute? Not clearly. Perhaps we can see if there's something that can be done technically to raise his sound. Not entirely. If the sound or the technical team perhaps at the back can see what they can do. Okay, so we'll come back to you, Minister, in just a short while, once the sound has been adequately tested, if that's all right. Okay, I'll wait for guidance from the floor in that regard. Suffice to say that if I come to you, Prof. Shimelis, for your reflections. We've heard quite a lot that has been said so far about the number of countries on the continent that are in debt distress. Okay, perfect. That are in debt distress at this present moment in time. We know that the risks of defaults are high, and there has been a few casualties in the recent past. Your reflections, sir, on the topic of hand today, and maybe even interventions on the issue around debt distress right now and defaults on the continent.
Thank you very much. Let me also express my appreciation to the African Development Bank for inviting me to this wonderful event. And good to be in the company of friends. I have been in this business also with them for a long time. So the African Economic Outlook, as most of you know, has brought out the African voice in a very, very telling way. So I would like to thank Professor Kevin Urama, who is the chief economist, leading this pack, and the preparation that it takes to come to this point is extremely, extremely laborious and requires a lot of expertise, care, particularly to inform, influence, and inspire African decision makers and tell their story as it is. Now that's what we heard today, the resilience of African economies. We don't talk much about it. But most importantly, in the light of this major, unprecedented, and rapidly evolving global shocks, Africa is still there, maintaining a steady economic growth. Even macroeconomic stability is not as bad as it would have been, given the kind of economic management we used to have a few decades back. So we are holding very well. Actually, the 18% inflation rate, if you take out a few extremely in high inflation situation, countries like Ethiopia, for instance, and others, the average inflation rate in Africa is low. Now, when it comes to the debt issue which you mentioned, I think already it has been mentioned in the report, but also distinguished panelists and the president of the African Development Bank said that Africa is not a bankrupt economy. It's not a continent that should have been suffering from liquidity challenges that we see today. But also some of the challenges I would like to apportion it to two causes. One is, of course, our own economic management. The other is the global financial system itself. The way it's built and the way it functions doesn't serve the interests of Africa. This is well noted. I think, as the commissioner indicated, there are a lot of gaps and holes in how to deal with the debt situation we are in today. So let me just mention first, what does it mean even countries in debt distress? You know, there are different ways of looking at it. If you look at Ethiopia, for instance, the debt to GDP ratio is much lower than anywhere else. But the cost of borrowing, and of course, the returns to the debt investments that we have made, has not been aligned, unfortunately. So it has put us in a liquidity crunch. However, the country can revive and even be able to carry a large amount of debt to finance its investment needs. Ethiopia has been growing, for instance, over 10% for over a decade with an investment to GDP ratio of 40%, unseen in many African countries, a saving rate that shoot up from merely 5% to 22% in 2019. So you know, the country could transform itself within a short space of time. For instance, as the president of the bank mentioned, had the global financing mechanisms been favorable, like the interest rate 9% charging poor countries, what is the point? By credit agencies. The ratings are based on, not on needs, on vulnerabilities, but rather more ability to pay, which is defined from their prism. So I think African voice have reached to a point where global financial architecture has to be significantly overhauled. It has to be inclusive, it has to be just, and it has to be also gives room for what we call global safety nets during liquidity challenges. So I think what we are seeing debt distress today is artificially created by a system where the African potentials are not captured well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. A system that has been historically unfair in a sense, but I like what you did mention, so about the fact that some of the challenges that we are experiencing as a continent is as a result of some of our own mismanagement. I mean, I just reflect on the country that I come from, South Africa, and we're talking about domestic resource mobilization and the liquidity of capital markets. We've got the largest on the continent, and we've got an active participation of investors in it, but we also pay a very high price for that debt, just as a result of unfairness in ratings, of course, but a lot of it being as a result of mismanagement when we do look at how economic affairs have been managed, when you also look at what is happening regarding the infrastructure around our electricity and our ports. With that said, I'd like to see if we can get Professor Minister of Finance, of course, Tuli Ngubi back with us. The system, so the system. Yes, there you go. Wonderful, wonderful. So I'll hand the virtual floor to you. Okay, Minister, we heard him just a moment ago. Minister Ngube, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
And we can hear you clearly too, so you can continue.
Thanks very much. Just to congratulate the African Development Bank for the report, which is really on point, and I think they raise very pertinent issues about Africa's growth prospects for 2024, and also appreciate the contributions from Professor Sachs and Commissioner and Professor Bebe Schmeles. Very important points that they raise indeed. Just looking at the growth pattern, I really agree that my region, which is Southern Africa, is really projected to grow the slowest. I want to highlight a factor here, which is that of climate change. That, for example, in Zimbabwe, we expect growth to slow down. Last year, we had a growth rate of 5.3%. In 2024, we expect a growth rate of 3.5%, likely due to climate shocks. So really, we expect a lower rainfall pattern is already showing. And, as they say that in our part of the world, a Minister of Finance is also a Minister of Agriculture. So I worry whether the rains are good or not. And it means I have to start worrying about, grain imports, and that's real. So really, it means we have to invest more in climate proofing our agriculture if we want to, I think, achieve sustainable economic growth. So climate proofing agriculture is a very critical issue in ensuring sustained economic growth going forward. Let me raise another issue regarding debt. Again, the debt situation is rather elevated. We're aware a few countries, trying to restructure their debts, including ourselves. For example, we've got the G20 Common Framework, and I believe that Zambia, Ghana, Ethiopia, Chad are on that program. And Zimbabwe has got a different program. We've started our own engagement with creditors to try to restructure our debt and get some debt relief. It's really holding back economic growth if we don't deal with it, and we're determined that this be sorted out. So that process is continuing. It means that we would have to then focus on specific reforms, economic reforms, governance reforms, and also reforms around property rights for the agricultural sector. So we're working very well with all our creditors, and we hope that over the next year or two, the issue of debt in Zimbabwe will be resolved. But let me highlight something else. If you look at global interest rates, this has been mentioned in the report and by other panelists, interest rates have really shot up, and this is an issue, including SDRs. I don't know that colleagues are aware that when we received the SDRs from the IMF, the interest rates were like 0.2% or something. And now the interest rate on SDRs is more like 4.5%. So even resources that we thought were concessionary are no longer concessionary. And this really speaks to the changing credit situation globally, where interest rates have gone up, and we're feeling the pain of the debt service costs. An issue was raised by President Adesina on this natural resource governance issues. I must say Zimbabwe takes this very, very seriously. And in the case of the lithium sector, we've actually, passed a law that really no exporter should export raw lithium, for example. Everything should be beneficiated up to the level of lithium sulfate, because that way you can increase the price easily 10 times but just insisting on beneficiation. This will improve our export sales. So really, as part of that natural governance is insisting on beneficiation, and I think that's the right thing to do. The other issue that we're really insisting on is that it's really the removal of all tax, incentives for the mining sector, in the sense that why give these tax incentives? The mining sector, they know how to give themselves tax incentives through all manner of structures that they can put in place with the help of the accountants. So why should governments do that? But really, we should be insisting on beneficiation. If they beneficiate, that's why we should be giving tax incentives at the beneficiation stage in terms of the value chain for these minerals. I thought that those are the things really that we should be highlighting. Now, coming to the we are grappling with inflation here on the domestic front. I think we'll deal with it successfully. We have tight monetary policy, and so it is partly the reason why growth will be slightly slower because of the tightness of liquidity. But it's necessary for us to deal with inflation and for us to be able to live within our means. I must say that on the fiscal front in Zimbabwe, we've really done well over the last 5 years and run deficits that are no more than 1.5% of GDP. They've all averaged 1.5% of GDP. We've done very well. But it's because really maybe I run a quasi-cash budgeting system and making sure that we don't live above our means. Then on the current account, I noticed that the report does say that will come under some squeeze. That is true even for us. We have had a current account surplus for the last 5 years, but this year, 2024, will be the smallest surplus. We're now down about $80 million from as high as $400 million 5 years ago. So really the what's in the report and what we're experiencing in Zimbabwe is very consistent, and I congratulate the ADB for this report. Let me stop here for now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And of course, thanks also to Prof. Sachs, who has to step out at this present moment in time. Professor Ram, I'm going to come to you in just a short while, but I just would also like the audience to know that we will be opening up for questions in a moment or two. So if there's any contribution that any of you will make, just indicate with the show of your hand. And what I wanted to ask you is the situation around the hard landing, and how much of a viability it is for certain parts of the continent. You have made mention of the fact that inflation continues to shoot in the wrong direction in many parts of Africa. And what we have seen is a continued aggressive intervention from central bankers. Let me not call it aggressive, because really they're trying to do all that they can do to bring this inflation down. But the question is at what cost, and whether this inflation is what actually takes a few economies into real recession or into a real hard landing on the African continent. Your interventions on that, sir, and how much of a viability a hard landing is for Africa, and which parts of Africa right now?
Thank you very much for that question. Before going into that, let me really appreciate the inputs and comments that's been made by the panelists, some of them traveling far and beyond to be here. Professor Jeffrey Sachs and his beautiful wife, Sonia Sachs, traveled all the way from the US to be here. We really appreciate that. And Commissioner Muchanga, my brother, Abebe Shimeles, and President Adesina, yourself, really appreciate you. And all those who are connected online, I know we have hundreds of you, if not thousands, connected, and those who are really here. The point you raise is one that is really sometimes touchy to discuss. Managing inflationary pressures often comes with, you call it hard landing, but maybe austerity measures also for countries. Because that's why I hinted that in my presentation, we've seen the fiscal consolidation that happened in the United States, in the Eurozone in the past 2 years. it was tough for citizens. Energy prices went up, food prices went up, many things really had significant issues there. But the difference is that then there is also fiscal policy measures that are put in place to cushion that impact on the most vulnerable, ensuring that while interest rates are going up, it doesn't crowd out small and medium scale enterprises, and it doesn't also impact on the vulnerable households significantly. And many African countries are doing that in terms of providing measures to cushion those impacts on countries. But the only thing I would say is that it's like pulling teeth. When you have a bad tooth, going to the dentist is often scary because it's painful, but when the tooth is pulled out, you feel better later. So that short-term hard or impacts of monetary and fiscal policies to address these challenges that we're having should not be a disincentive for not pulling out that tooth. Because if you leave the tooth, maybe it will affect more and more tooth, and then you have more problems going forward. So what I have seen in many African countries is actually a stellar job being done by central banks to try and manage inflation, actually using tools that in the continent is not as effective as it should be because of several structural factors in the economy that we have discussed in the report. But then we're seeing a lot of dividends in terms of, like in the Western Africa region, the Nigerian government has been implementing a lot of policies, tough for citizens, but we're seeing projections of growth rebounding in 2024, 2025 because of those policies. So my encouragement to citizens and policymakers is to ensure that we have a measured approach and a balanced approach between monetary and fiscal policy to ensure that it doesn't create hard landing too much for citizens.
Okay. I think they refer to it as the Goldilocks scenario, that balance of those two measures. Any questions from the floor before we close? Or comments that you'd like to make? Okay, I think that everything that has been, or that is, that was required to be said, has been said. But any parting shots from the panel before I hand over to you, Professor Orama, for the official close?
Let me share a secret with you.
It's answer.
Which one of you slept 8 hours last night? Any hands? I slept 1 hour, 40 minutes. But because of my commitment to this meeting, I said I'm going to be strong. So I went to bed about 20 to 6, and about 7:10 I was up to be here. Yeah. Having said that, I think my parting shot is that we've got very good partnership with the African Development Bank, and certainly when we move together, we are stronger. So as African Union Commission, we'll always be on hand whenever we have to move together to say, let's move together. And as we go into the G20, the African Development Bank is going to be one of our knowledge partners. So the information that is coming out is going to be translated into policy proposals when we are making proposals at the level of the G20. So the work you are doing is very, very useful. And once again, congratulations.
No, I think it's been a wonderful discussion. Just to follow up on the inflation hard landing you mentioned. I was in Nairobi last year, living there throughout the COVID time, and nothing of the sort happened until the war in Ukraine triggered a significant hike in the prices. Even when the government was pouring money during the COVID time increased subsidies, reduced taxes, and spent a lot on social protection, things were okay. And then the war in Ukraine, for various reasons, we don't need to go into it. Prices, inflation started to rise, not only in Kenya, but in many, many African countries. So this is beyond their control. One is that fact. The other is the shock therapy that Prof mentioned may not have to be painful as well. So there are, I think the AU Commissioner mentioned, and which I indicated earlier again, the international financial architecture need to respond to this narrowing physical space in African countries at the time when they were doing excellent job managing the economy from collapsing. So that is my parting point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And thank you, not to keep anyone in this room here any further. Ambassador, I get your point. But many people are tired and do need to rejuvenate. But just perhaps if we can just get a closing remark from Professor Tuli Ncube, the Minister of Finance over at Zimbabwe. So I'm not too sure how many hours of sleep that you had, and at the risk of being unpopular to you also, just to spare a minute or two more of your time. So just to let us know what you'd like us to take away.
Thank you very much. I was only awake for, rather sleep for 3 hours, so much shorter than the commissioner. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yes, we can hear you.
We can hear you, sir.
Oh, fabulous. I think really the AFDB should continue with the thought leadership drive to assist us who are policymakers on the ground, assist us in making sure that we can support those critical growth drivers that will continue to build resilience, that will enable us to build the national shock absorbers to be able to absorb all these shocks, whether it's price shocks or interest rate shocks, HDFDB to continue doing this steady work. For us here, the issue really is climate change. That is a shock that is we need to respond to, and we have to invest in climate proofing our agriculture, and I suspect other countries in Southern Africa will be doing the same. Here I can think of a country like Mozambique, which will be affected by similar issues, Mozambique, but also Malawi, which will be affected by similar climate conditions. So this is a real. The other issue really that's urgent for us is one of debt restructuring. So really any continental driven ideas about dealing with this issue rather than on a one-on-one basis would be helpful, so that we have a comprehensive, holistic approach on how Africa could be assisted in this debt restructuring drive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And just on my parting shot, a big congratulations, obviously, for yourselves, but Professor Rama, the entire team that contributed to these insights. I think that now the work does stand with those who are at the close proximity of policymakers who can ensure that a lot of the change and the recommendations that this report advocates for can be done and should be implemented. And what I can say is that us as members of the media, we also look forward to understanding further the insights of this report so we can continue to hold to account those of you who you know should be doing more. But with that said, thank you to everyone also for your participation. It's a close.